La directrice du Club Suisse de la Presse et moi, je suis donc Louisa Baline. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à vous, mesdames et messieurs, qui êtes dans la salle, et à vous, mesdames et messieurs, qui nous suivez en ligne pour la présentation donc d'une recherche. Je vais, si vous le permettez, passer à l'anglais maintenant. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much for being with us today here at the Swiss Press Club. I welcome the person who are with us in the room and you, ladies and gentlemen, who are following us online. I immediately I will give the floor to you, Dr. Umesh Palwankar, but first we'll have a short video. Tobias, please.
Since October 7, 2023, violence has overcome Gaza and Israel, leaving a trail of destruction and human suffering. Civilians caught in the crossfire. Families torn apart. The right to life, dignity, and safety shattered. Today, the Geneva Centre brings forth a detailed analysis of these violations, examining the human cost and what must be done to protect the most vulnerable. Welcome to the presentation of Vortex of Pain, Human Rights Implications of the Israel-Gaza Armed Conflict.
Thank you. Dr. Palwankar, you are the Executive Director of the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue. The floor is yours, sir. Yeah, you can speak.
Thank you. Thank you, Louisa. And I would like to join with Louisa in thanking all of you, Excellencies from Permanent Missions, dear friends and colleagues, which shows your high interest in and concern regarding the critical situation, which is the subject of this research paper, Human Rights Implications of the Gaza Conflict. Allow me to express my gratitude also to the Swiss Press Club and to Madame Falconier, the director, for hosting this important event. We are privileged to have three renowned experts to present the paper and their own deep and valuable analysis in that regard. Professor Surya Deva, to my left, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. Next to him, Professor Claire Somerville, Director of the Gender Centre of the Graduate Institute, Geneva. And to her left, Professor Tignino, University of Geneva and Deputy Director, Platform for International Water Law, Geneva Water Hub. Let me quickly just tell you about something about the Geneva Centre, which is an international human rights think tank and advocacy institution with special consultative status at ECOSOC. Our activities are based on 4 pillars: research and publications, of course, on human rights, training and national capacity building, international advocacy through following and reporting on major human rights developments and conferences, in particular, but not only, the Human Rights Council, and promoting a global dialogue on vital human rights issues of universal concern through organization of conferences and panels such as this one. This research paper on the human rights implications of the Israel-Gaza war is from an objective and human rights perspective without any political, religious, or other considerations. The paper analyzes the wide range and large-scale violations of the entire spectrum of human rights and its present, mid, and long-term consequences for the population, examines the role and shortcomings of existing human rights mechanisms to ensure compliance with human rights, and provides perspectives for the future in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Palwankar. I am pleased now to give the floor to you, Professor Surya Deva. You are the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Development. You are also the Director of the Centre for Environmental Law at the Macquarie University in Australia. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and good afternoon now, in fact, good afternoon, everyone. So at the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation, and also in particular, I would like to mention the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue, because I strongly believe that dialogues are needed more and more in today's very polarized world and very politicized world. World is facing tremendous number of challenges. We are going to discuss one of those. But there are many other challenges, and I believe that it is critical that there are spaces where people can come together, and even if they wish to disagree, they disagree in the same room. That is important, rather than we having parallel conversations in separate echo chambers, because that doesn't really help, in my view. I have read the research paper and would like to comment the author of the research paper. So it provides definitely a balanced and objective perspective on a range of human rights violations. In my remarks, what I wish to do is I wish to focus on three aspects. I will make some remarks as part of the context from the perspective of my mandate on right to development. Because when I was looking at the paper, I was thinking, oh, what value addition can I provide? So instead of picking on the findings in the paper itself, I want to build on this paper and add the right to development dimension to this whole discussion that we are doing today. So I will start with a little bit of the context and then try to mention how the conflict which is ongoing is impacting the right to development of people in Gaza. And then I will also mention how right to development as a framework provides some ideas how to deal with these conflicts in future and how to we go about that. So let us start with the context. As most of us in this room will recall, the current architecture of human rights as well as the United Nations system is built precisely to overcome the conflicts that we are witnessing in the world at this point of time, right? So UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the UN Charter, they make explicit reference to the two previous world wars and how we need to do better and differently going forward. So I wanted to remind everyone that the whole architecture of human rights in the UN system is based on overcoming these conflicts. But let us look at the paradoxical situation. If that was the goal, in today's time, the data indicates that we have the highest number of conflicts in the world at this point of time since the Second World War. So that shows that the current architecture is facing definitely a stress. Is it fit for the purpose? That question is obvious, because if the objective of the architecture was to prevent conflicts, to promote human rights, and if it is failing to achieve these core goals, then I think it is a legitimate question to ask that is it fit for the purpose and what needs to change in that architecture. The second point of context I want to mention is about the relationship between conflicts and human rights. And today, of course, we are focusing on how this conflict is impacting human rights, and I think this paper documents that almost all human rights are impacted, civil, political human rights, as well as social, economic, and cultural human rights. Of course, the paper does not cover each and every human right, but provides a sample of the impact on a broad range of human rights. But what I would like to mention here is that that is only one side of the picture. The other side of the picture is that if there is a consistent violation of human rights, that also triggers conflict. So conflicts, of course, undermine human rights. But we could also analyze conflicts as well as this current armed conflict in Israel-Palestine situation, that there have been decades of violations of human rights of population, and that is part of the dynamic why we are facing this current conflict. So I think we should understand that this dynamic relationship So lack of human rights, and if there's systemic violation of human rights for decades, that will also force people to rise and think, oh, the institutions do not really work for us. We have to do something different and extraordinary to push against this narrative and protect our human rights. And of course, that has a significant impact on the right to development as well. Now, the paper documents all other human rights, but I will focus on right to development. But what is right to development? It is a right of every human person as well as peoples collectively. And I think that is a unique dimension of this human right, which is there in some other human rights as well, that it has both individual dimension and a collective dimension. So of course, right to development belongs to each one of us in this room and everyone in the world. And we have that freedom to realize our capabilities for the holistic development. But it is also a collective right of the peoples together. And I think that's quite relevant in the context of this conflict, because the people of Gaza together, the people of Palestine together are also suffering. So it's not merely an individual right of development, but community together is also suffering. And I think that is very crucial. Now, the 1986 Declaration on Right to Development also highlights, very crucial in my view, that everyone has a right to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy. Often when we talk about human rights, we keep focusing on enjoyment of human rights, which is crucial. But right to development is not a passive right. It is an active right. People have a right to participate in decision-making processes. And this participation is active, free, and meaningful. And I think that's very crucial in the context of preventing conflicts as well. Are you able to participate in those decision-making processes? And of course, when we talk about right to development, it has 4 facets of it: economic, social, cultural, and political. Often when we think of right to development, we think of merely economic development. But normatively, that is not a sound understanding. And if you look at the declaration, it talks about all these 4 dimensions of the development, which we cannot ignore. Now, if we look at the conflict, and I will go beyond 7th October onwards, the conflict, because it has been ongoing. So we cannot separate this chapter of the conflict from what has gone before, in my view. We have to look at the big picture of this conflict. So what has been there? The situation of occupation, situation of aggression, and both sides, I mean, even Hamas, how Hamas has captured these innocent people, you know. So both dimensions of it, they definitely undermine the right to development of the people on both sides of the spectrum, in my view. All these dimensions are there. Then the right to development also has, in my view, 4 overarching principles, and I think they're also impacted by this. One is intersectionality. There should not be any discrimination. And of course, in a situation of conflict, some people suffer more. Women, children, as an example of it. Persons with disability may also suffer more. Pregnant women may suffer more. So there could be dual disproportionality which may arise in those particular situations, right? So I think we need to bear in mind that when we're talking about the impact of conflict on human rights, it's not that all of us will be impacted in a similar way. We will be impacted very differently based on who we are and who every person is. And I think that dimension is crucial. The second aspect is intergenerational equity. I think this paper, unless I missed it, does not focus, and of course it cannot focus on everything, on the future generations. But I will touch upon this issue because I just presented a report on this. What I'm trying to highlight here is that the conflicts will impact, including this conflict, will impact not only current generations of people, it will impact future generations. And I'm talking about even those who are not born yet. And I will go beyond human beings because the war, the conflict is having impact on the ecosystem, the environment, the access to water and lakes and resources. So how the new generation, the future generations will take birth in that part of the world, that is going to be impacted what we have been witnessing last 1 year or so or even beyond. The third principle is self-determination. Now, self-determination is an independent human right, of course. But as part of right to development, this is an overarching principle. And of course, that principle is at stake here because these people are struggling to realize their self-determination. people in Palestine, right? The idea of having a two-state solution and all that. The fourth is fair distribution, and I will skip it in the interest of time. So let me quickly now mention about how the right to development framework can provide a framework for resolving this conflict. I will mention the first element is cooperation. Under the 1986 declaration, we have a duty to cooperate. States must cooperate. And this is very explicit in Article 3.3 as well as in Article 6 of the declaration. We cannot resolve this conflict unless states come together and collaborate and cooperate. They have to cooperate to prevent the conflict, to cease the conflict, but they also need to cooperate to rebuild what has been destroyed in this conflict. So whenever there is a ceasefire, there will be tremendous amount of help needed to revive and survive the people there. The second element is that Article 5 of the declaration talks about that the states have obligations to protect people from human rights violations, which is very standard principle of international human rights law. But what is the value addition of principle, Article 5 of the declaration? It expressly talks about colonization. It expressly mentions foreign occupation. It expressly mentions about aggression. It expressly mentions about refusal to recognize self-determination. So states have to protect, and that is the context we are seeing in this conflict of Israel-Gaza here that we are dealing with, that is very much there. And my last point, I will finish with that, is reference to Article 7. Article 7 of the Declaration of 1986 talks about the need to establish and maintain peace and security. And it also goes beyond saying it. It talks about disarmament. Why do we have conflicts? There are many reasons for it, and I have alluded to some of this. But one thing which I have not mentioned yet is we have conflicts partly because there are actors who benefit financially and otherwise from conflicts. There's an arms industry. If there's a peace in the world, they will not be able to sell their weapons. So armed industry all over the world is benefiting from conflicts. That is where disarmament is a crucial point. How much money did the world spend last year on the military expenditure? 2.4 trillion US dollars. Just last year I'm talking about. If we can spend even 25% of that money in taking care of human rights all over the world, it will be a different place. So I think we need to look at this. We need to reform the Security Council, because we cannot veto against crimes which are in breach of international criminal law and international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And we have to hold the actors accountable, whether these are the state actors or the private actors who are benefiting from this conflict. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. UN Special Rapporteur. I now give the floor to Professor Claire Somerville. You are the director of the Gender Centre at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies here in Geneva. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and importantly, I think, making a space to offer a gender perspective on this. So I'm going to speak from my standpoint of an academic and also an activist, a feminist. I'm also a medical anthropologist, so my focus has been on health and the health rights of women and girls in particular. I'm particularly concerned with those health and health rights in contexts of peace, conflict and humanitarian scenarios. And I'm very I'm passionate to insist that we address the systemic and the persistent gender inequalities in our world that are particularly exacerbated in times of conflict. The world at the moment, as you mentioned, faces an unparalleled number of conflicts, protracted and escalating, from Sudan to Ukraine, DRC to Gaza, and many, many more. And these have a very disproportionate effect and impact on women and girls. The burden of armed conflict and the humanitarian context they generate have a number of very specific impacts on women and girls, and I'd like to highlight just a few before moving on to some suggestions and some ways to leverage a human rights approach towards a sustainable and perhaps also a feminist peace and post-conflict reconstruction. So this is just a few of the disparities and the disproportionate impact. I'm going to begin with the ways in which conflict escalates gender-based violence, violence against women. This barrage of violence can range from intimate partner violence, sexual harassment and psychological abuse at checkpoints, during evacuations and during military operations, through to the use of sexual violence as a tactic or weapon of war. Whilst these abuses are also directed at men and boys, the majority of such violations and violence falls upon women and girls. For girls, there is the added risk of early and forced child marriage. In violent humanitarian contexts where systems of education and security collapse and risk of famine looms, child marriage can sometimes be thought of as a survival strategy and protection against threats of sexual violence. However, it renders girls vulnerable to sexual exploitation, vulnerable to unsafe and high-risk early pregnancy, and life-threatening preterm childbirth. Thirdly, with the collapse of health systems and health services, access to sexual and reproductive health have a severe and life-threatening impact on women and girls and unborn and newborns. UNFPA estimate there are 500,000 women of reproductive age in Gaza, of whom 50,000 are pregnant with little or no access to maternal or child health services. UNFPA reported just a week ago that they have only managed to get one secure truckload of reproductive health supplies into the area since July to serve what is estimated to be about 5,000 births a month. UN Women's most recent survey data reports that from Gaza report that life-threatening increases in infections of the reproductive system, but all cause infections. And these are causing preterm births, hemorrhaging, stillbirth, as well as an increase in other infections due to the lack of clean water, sanitation, and menstrual hygiene supplies. Added to this, UN Women estimate that a third of children under 2 are suffering from malnutrition. And we know some areas and populations are on the verge of famine. UN Women have called a gender alert on the war on women's health. This is just a snapshot in one context. The health situation for women and girls in Gaza are dire, as your report describes as a vortex of pain. I think that captures it. There are some immediate and then middle and long-term calls to actions and strategies, and I want to focus a little bit on these because I think we should find ways to move forward collectively. Of course, the first and foremost is to halt the military operations and have a full international humanitarian relief response so that these women and girls whose lives have been devastated by conflict have a chance. In presenting a gender-responsive and perhaps almost also a feminist approach, it's crucial to leverage the international instruments we have at hand. And yes, a human rights approach, absolutely, but we must also, I believe, call upon the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is crucial, and it's actually 9 subsequent resolutions that form the basis of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We have some tools, we need to implement them. Women from across the life cycle must be at the negotiations. We know from decades of data and evidence and conflicts around the world that there will never be lasting peace without women's full and equal participation in peace processes. They are key to leading post-conflict reconstruction and a shift from militarized security to human security. Secondly is engaging civil society. For example, I give WILP, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which has a strong MENA chapter. They engage grassroots activism across the MENA region, which include women's human rights defenders, community-based organisations, and women's peace networks. Opportunities like this to engage these groups are critical to amplify the voices of women and girls from the ground, to advocate for rights, accountability, and justice, and reimagining that peace table. Finally, encouraging governments around the world to prioritise gender equality. It's set out in the SDGs, to adopt the 3 core pillars, perhaps, of Margaret Wallström's feminist foreign policy. The 3 R's they were referred to: women's rights, women's resources, and women's representation. The international community, as you say in the report, has a duty to respond, to restore the health and the rights of women and girls in the Gaza armed conflict and the many other conflicts around the world. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Somerville. And now I give the floor to you, Professor Tignino. You are the senior lecturer at the Global Studies Institute of the University of Geneva. You are also director of the Platform for International Water Law at the Geneva Water Hub.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I feel really honored to be in such important panel, and also many thanks to the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue to develop this report on the Vortex of Pain. So my presentation would like to focus on the implication for the access to water from an international humanitarian law perspective. So in the report that you saw, the focus is on human rights law, but there is the important role played by international humanitarian law. So what are the obligations under international humanitarian law? Humanitarian law imposes stringent obligations on occupying powers concerning the welfare of the civilians in the occupied territory. So Israel has the occupying power of Gaza, and this was clearly recognized by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice this July, is legally bound to ensure the welfare of the civilians and must prioritize their access to fundamental necessities such as safe drinking water. So any deliberate action that impede or restrict access to water for the civilian population of Gaza can be considered as a violation of international humanitarian law. And I'm here referring to Articles 55 and 56 of the 4th Geneva Convention. So I would like to highlight 3 aspects of violations of international humanitarian law. That is the cutting off the water supply and starvation, the conduct of the hostilities, and the humanitarian access and assistance. So maybe you remember that from the beginning of the armed conflict in Gaza, there was a public announcement of the Israeli defense minister of a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off food, electricity, fuel, and water. So cutting off water supply and the essential means of survival could implicate the international responsibility under international humanitarian law. And scholars have developed the interpretation that is also reflected in customary international humanitarian law that the starvation is a crime of war, even if there is not the direct purpose. So what I want to say, it is that the prohibition of starvation derives from the prohibition to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And customary international humanitarian law is binding on Israel. So rules 54 and 55 of Customary International Humanitarian Law that you can access in the website of ICRC are clear about starvation and the protection of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. So starvation for any motive is a violation of international humanitarian law. So regarding the second element, regarding the conduct of hostilities, here also international humanitarian law set clear principles, customary principles of international humanitarian law binding all states, that are the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precautions. So for every and each attack, there is a process of assessment that militaries have to follow. That is the statute of the target object, the actual or intended use of the object by the opposing part, the military significance of the targeted object, and whether or not the attacker has taken all the feasible precautions to minimize or prevent the civilian harm. So it is also essential to recognize that the extensive destruction and harm that we witness and we see every day in our screen in Gaza exacerbate the animosity between the parties and perpetuate this cycle of violence and violation of international law. Then there is the third element that is ensuring humanitarian access and assistance. And I would like to remind that the resolution that was adopted by the UN Security Council last May, sponsored by Switzerland and other 97 states, which calls all states to respect and protect the United Nations and humanitarian personnel. So this resolution also reflects customary international law and is binding all state parties. So let me give a brief overview of the existing accountability efforts to address the armed conflict in Gaza. Maybe we can go back to this aspect later, but there is a proceeding before the International Court of Justice started in December 23 by South Africa, that South Africa brought the case saying that Israel action in Gaza amount to the crime of genocide under the Genocide Convention. So I want to highlight here that the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice in this case is confined to the matters related to the Genocide Convention. So this means that in its final judgment, the ICJ can only address whether the Israel action amount to the crime of genocide. And maybe as you know, the International Court of Justice has adopted 3 provisional measures that try not to alleviate the immediate harm to the civilian population of Gaza. Then we have also efforts of accountability before the International Criminal Court. So we have 2 arrest warrants that have been submitted by the ICC prosecutor to a pre-trial chamber in May 24. And what I would like to highlight in this request to the pre-trial chamber, it is that there are not charges related to indiscriminate and or disproportionate attacks. So even here, the scope is limited. And then also there are efforts at before national courts. There are even cases related to the ongoing armed conflict in Gaza before jurisdiction in Israel, before the Israeli High Court of Justice. So this is also important to stress. And there are also cases before domestic courts of the US, UK, Germany, and Netherlands. Then I would like to conclude by referring to the 2 resolutions that were just adopted this week in New York at the UN General Assembly related to Palestine. So the first resolution upgraded the status of Palestine as an observer state, but it is the UN General Assembly request to the Security Council to reconsider the position regarding the admission of Palestine in the UN according to Article 4 of the UN Charter. And then the second resolution that really I invite you to read, here I have a copy, and here we can see that there is extensive reference to the ICJ advisory opinion that was adopted in July, and there are also several requests that have been adopted, that have been requested to third states, like for example the reduction of arms transfer to Israel if this arms transfer can contribute to the violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law in Palestine. And also there is another request made to the government of Switzerland to convene in 6 months a conference of the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Tignino. Before we open the floor for questions, may I ask one question to you, Dr. Polwankar? What do you expect after the presentation of this research paper? First of all, to whom are you going to send it? And what can be the impact of your paper?
Yes, thank you indeed, Luisa, for that question. I'll be very brief because we leave time for the question and answer session. Is that the distribution of this will be very widespread. It will be put online. It will be. We will try to also get it published in some specialized international reviews, if possible. They will decide, and we will continue to be able to put it out also to academia, to the journalists, and that's where also the Swiss Press Club could help. And the impact is to draw attention to the human, as the paper says, the human rights implications in the, not just the short, because a lot of reports deal with the short-term implications, but also mid to long-term, to which Professor Surya, Deva, and Professor Claire and Professor Tignino referred also in terms of violations. The ongoing violence. Let's hope that the message that came from the Tehran conference in '68, and which you echoed, Professor Surya, is that peace is a prerequisite for the full enjoyment of human rights, and war is its negation. So hopefully, the paper will also, serve to open minds and to come to the negotiating table and to the dialogue, and as you said, the conference room together and not apart. Thank you.
Thank you. The same question to the three panelists. What is for you, or what could be for you, Dr. Surya, Deva, the impact of this research?
I mean, first of all, the impact is that it is possible to document human rights abuses without a political lens. Mm-hmm. Because human rights are very political, of course. Mm-hmm. Politics is there. So I will not pretend that human rights are not political. But what I see in the world is that there's a lot of selectivity in terms of human rights. We focus on certain rights and ignore other human rights. That is one selectivity. The second selectivity is that we ignore, let us say I am a state, I will ignore the human rights violations of my friendly states. Mm-hmm. And I will just pick on the human rights violations happening in non-friendly states. That is the second selectivity that is problematic. So I think we need more objective and consistent articulation of human rights violations. All human rights everywhere, violated by anyone, should be a concern for us. And I think we need to collectively work together to ensure that we can make some progress in fighting back against the regression that we see in realizing human rights, in my view. So hopefully this paper will contribute to that discourse. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Somerville.
Thank you. I think the report helps us to, well, it reminds us on how foundational a human rights approach is as we hopefully move towards at some point, peace and reconstruction. And it also, I think, helps us to think through and add to the different rights, that some of which are outlined in the report, and remind us also the need for a multi-stakeholder engagement. And I really would, as well as member states of the UN, I think you mentioned disarmament, and I think that, that sector needs to be engaged in this. And I would also, from my perspective, really add the role of civil society and women's networks, half the population of the globe who need to be engaged in these strategies moving forward.
Thank you. And for you, Dr. Tignino, what can be the impact?
Yes, I think it is very important to disseminate this report and also to really show how all human rights are interconnected. So there is no first class of human rights and second class, let's say. And then also, as it was just mentioned, that human rights are the prerequisite of peace. So when we have an armed conflict, we will have automatically violations of human rights.
Thank you. Now the floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen. I ask you to identify yourself and ask questions and not make statements, please. Thank you. Bob, please.
Robert James Parsons, independent journalist and geopolitical analyst, and I'd like to make a statement because there's something that's been horribly ignored. One of my major points of focus since 1996 has been armaments, and I've been looking at the weapons used in Gaza. Just before October 7th, the Pentagon shipped to Israel 10,000 Mk-84s. The end of June it was. Reuters published a figure that that there were 14,000 there. That figure was contested by a tiny handful of analysts saying the figures are low. The Mk-84 is the famous 900-kilo bomb. It's made of uranium. Gaza is permanently contaminated. The group of analysts I'm working with, we figure there's at least 1,000 tons of uranium that's been dumped on Gaza.
Bob, may I ask you, what is your question, please?
Why is nobody looking at this? I mean, the land is permanently contaminated. Look at the definitive study on Fallujah after the United States assault there and what has happened, what it looks like. Gaza is Fallujah writ large. The land is uninhabitable. And the idea that you're going to redevelop it, do anything, is nonsense. It is permanently contaminated. And we have they did not ship 14,000 of these to Israel simply to put them in a storage facility. They've been used, and we see them on the films. For your own interest, watch the films. If you see a bomb hit, you'll probably see gray smoke rising. That's called urban smoke. It's buildings.
Your question, please, Bob. Your question, please.
If you watch it and you see a brilliant red flash, that's the uranium going off. It burns at up to 6,000 degrees. And then you'll see the black smoke. Those are the uranium particles. They've been picked up as far afield as Aldermaston, southwest of London, which is a major air filtering monitoring center. Otherwise, one last point, the Israeli Social Service has said there are over 70,000 permanently disabled Israeli soldiers now. It's impossible that they were injured.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. What is the question, Bob, please?
Uranium particles, just like the veterans from the Gulf War, which were the people I first worked with, 350,000 of them, most of whom died horrible deaths. That's Gaza today. Take a look at it, please.
Somebody wants to respond to the statement, or we can go to another question. Yes, please. Yes, madam.
Yes, my name's Lucy Morgan-Edwards. I'm a freelance journalist. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. My question really relates to, first of all, thank you all for your excellent presentations and work. I'm not directly familiar with the Middle East as much as Afghanistan. However, I wonder if you've also considered, because in disseminating your message, we now have a situation where activists in the UK are being detained and harassed by the misuse of the Terrorism Act. So activists who've been trying to advocate for Gaza and Palestine, such as Richard Medhurst and Sarah Palestine, have found themselves detained under this Terrorism Act. So, even in the West, we now have a situation where our freedom of speech and our right to speak out is being massively violated. And this is obviously going to have a knock-on effect on situations such as Gaza. So I wonder how you're able to take that into account in disseminating your report.
Other questions? Yes, Madam, please.
Thanks. My name is Fatina. This is addressed to Professor Deva. Thank you for your comprehensive speech. And I think you're the only UN official that speaks of reforming the UN Security Council, which in my view is very obsolete. This veto system doesn't make any sense anymore in this present world. So are there any steps being taken in that direction? Or, because let me just add, I'm not a negative person, but in my view, the UN is a toothless tiger. All the General Assembly resolutions, whatever, you have it, you name it, have no impact and no one really applies them. And the Security Council is another story. So are there any directions to reform this obsolete, very obsolete, outdated UN Security Council? Thanks.
Thank you for your question, sir.
Thank you. So let me start in the reverse order. I'll start with your question because that is the most pertinent question you asked, I think, about the reform of the Security Council. I think there are some processes going on in terms of expanding the Security Council to have more permanent members. There's some discussion about how do we reform the veto system as well. There has been ongoing discussion, and that has also been escalated a bit because of the situation in Russia-Ukraine war as well as the Israel-Gaza conflict. But the challenge is that the five powers that enjoy the veto, they would not like to give away their veto power. So I think we need a fundamental rethinking. So maybe we need some practical solutions. One practical solution that I've informally mentioned, and I will say it here because you asked the question, could be that we limit the number of vetoes every country has for a year. Now the number of vetoes is unlimited. So you can veto 20 times in a week. So let us say we give every country 2 veto powers a month or a year or whatever the number is. Then they will be more careful in using that veto power, because now it's a power that's completely being misused. And of course, the larger question is about the reform of the UN as an institution. It is not representative enough, but that goes beyond UN, even the World Bank, IMF and all that, those are institutions. You mentioned UN is a toothless tiger. It is potentially yes, but it is a toothless tiger because the states want it to be a toothless tiger. If a state would like UN to be more powerful, it is going to be counterproductive for them. Because then states will be held accountable for violations of human rights, international human rights law and all that. So it is a very difficult situation. We need reform, but the very actors who could get this reform done, they don't want to do it. And I think if you look at the text of the Pact for the Future, which will be adopted next week, it gives an indication how difficult it is to change anything. There are a lot of declarations, a lot of good words, but things are not moving in this direction in my view. If I could very briefly comment, yes, this is a major challenge. Restrictions on civic space and how these laws are being used selectively to target peaceful protest. That is definitely a concern, and that is happening increasingly now, even in so-called liberal democracies. Of course, we talk about the authoritarian regimes where the civic space is less, but definitely, I live in Australia, so we have had similar challenges when students were protesting on campus, for instance. So how do we deal with those situations? So it has been a very complex situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I turn to Tobias. Tobias, I ask you if we have questions online.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes. So we have a question from Emmanuel from the MBRS School of Government. And the question is, how can the international community effectively balance the urgent need for humanitarian intervention with the complex political realities of the conflict, while ensuring that human rights principles are upheld for all parties involved?
Thank you. Who wants to respond to this question?
I mean, I wanted to be representative, so I wanted to give the co-panelists a chance. My pragmatic view is that we definitely should push for reform of the institutions, including the United Nations. But I think we should also see solutions outside the UN system, in my view. What can people do together? What can investors do together? What can companies do together? To put pressure on those actors who are indulging in such a conflict, in flagrant violations of international human rights law, criminal law, international humanitarian law. So I think we should look at other centers of power than the formal structures which are there. It's not a magic solution, but I think we should explore those possibilities, in my view.
Thank you. Ladies, would you like to comment on that?
Maybe just to complement, it is really important to look also at what it happens at the domestic level. So it is not only at the international level, but as I mentioned in my presentation, there are several cases before national courts. So there are also, for example, the UK decided to reduce of 10% the export of arms to Israel. So there are some signs that go in the direction of better protection of human rights.
Thank you. Dr. Palankwa, you would like to
comment?
Thank
you. I just want to add also, and which is something that has been highlighted in the research paper as to how to reinforce mechanisms to ensure compliance, besides the UN system with all the shortcomings that it holds, and of course national courts, as Professor Tignino said. The paper also highlights, and this is a reflection of the Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocol 1, which is the state parties undertake to respect and ensure respect. Mm-hmm. So that is very important because it highlights the duty of third states to exercise influence over the warring parties to change their behavior and bring it in line with applicable international law. And how could they do so? And the research paper does identify, and I close there, measures that could do so would involve diplomatic avenues, sanctions, referrals to the UN Security Council, and to the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
Thank you. So if some people would like to read the whole paper, where can they find it?
Yes, we will be announcing it on social media platforms with a link to our website. It is also on our website, so it is fully available in public, to the public.
Thank you very much. Tobias, is there another question? No? Yes, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Alessandra. I have a couple of questions. First of all, I hope that you as scholars will be really engaged when a peace process will eventually start, and to include all your perspective from the access to water, the gender perspective is so very important, the development, active, and as the aspect that you said before, Professor Deva. This first of all. So I hope that you will be engaged, will be invited, as well as the think tank of Geneva Centre for Human Rights. I think it's so very important. The second, as a suggestion, maybe to send a paper to all Geneva and New York missions, the all UN chief, specialized agency, UN per se, but all the other agencies, WTO, which are not part of the UN per se, but are every has a part to play. And it's so very important what you're doing. It's maybe a little deceiving that we are not so many today, but as a civilian, simple citizen, we try to understand what this has happened and why, after so many years, as you say before, Professor Deva, that the war starts after there are so many years of denial of rights, all rights, gender rights, food rights, water rights. And so anyway, I still want to hope, as a normal citizen, that your work will be valued and given the right access and you become a voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. If you want to continue the discussion, there are some sandwiches and refreshment. I would like to thank you all for your presence here, and of course, I would like to thank our panelists, Professor Surya Deva, Professor Claire Somerville, Professor Mara Tignino, and you, Mr. Umesh Palwankar, for organizing, together with the Swiss Press Club, this event. Thank you very much and have a good day.